Hi, Katie. I wanted to leave you some feedback on your draft. First off, overall, the summary looks good. I think that you're hitting on the most important plot points to bring in the introductory paragraph so the reader has enough context to understand what's going on in the story. In addition, the key ideas that you're including seem to be pivotal moments of the text and ones that are important to discuss. There's a couple things that I want to talk to you about in terms of your thesis statement, and then also some of the ideas in the introduction to make these more clear. So in terms of your thesis statement, this is what you have listed. Williams is trying to justify throughout the story that the amount of force he uses on the girl is because he was just trying to save her life as well as her parents. But where is the line that crosses from force to assault? So it sounds like you're making a claim that Williams is in favor of the use of force because it's necessary to save a person's life, but then you're also posing this question that what's the gray area? So it kind of feels like you have two different thesis statements here, and the reader can't tell if you want to argue that it is justifiable or if you want to argue that there's this gray area. And that's because you're posing a question. So remember that a thesis statement is not a question, but your answer to a question can lead you to a thesis statement. So I really like the idea of you exploring that this quite possibly crossed the line. That's the exact question that Williams wants us to, as readers, to think about. And I think where were the key moments in the text where he really crossed the line, right? We are privy to all of his internal dialogue for a reason, right? We get to hear all those private thoughts that, normally we wouldn't be privy to, that those are just passing fantasy thoughts in somebody's head. But we're privy to all of that, right? And we're supposed to kind of question, well, I shouldn't say kinda, we are supposed to question a lot of his line of thinking. So in terms of revision, I like the question that you're posing, but make sure that you get this into a thesis statement. I want to talk to you about the first part of the thesis too. So there's two things that I really want to talk to you about. You say Williams is trying to justify the amount of force he uses. So be careful to not conflate the author with the doctor, okay? Because Williams doesn't use force, the doctor does. And I would argue that Williams doesn't try to justify the use of force. The doctor tries to justify his use of force through the internal dialogue. But I would argue that Williams does the exact opposite. In fact, Williams is asking us to think about the question that you're posing. So I think you got a little bit of revision in there because you have to be fair to the author's intent, right? You are allowed to disagree with the author, but in order to do that, you have to be fair to the author's intent. And I don't think that Williams is trying to justify the doctor's use of force. In fact, I think Williams is trying to say, what went wrong here? Williams would align himself with the question that you pose at the end of this sentence. So make sure that you make a clear distinction between the character of the doctor and the author. They're not the same person, and this sentence reads as if they are. And secondly, this sentence is a little awkward. It's a little wonky. So the ideas are good, but the way that you have this phrased is a little confusing for the reader. So let me read this to you again. Williams is trying to justify. You say throughout the story, get rid of that. It's unnecessary. So I would read this like Williams is trying to justify the amount of force the doctor uses on the girl. But this is where it gets confusing, is because he was just trying to save her life as well as her parents. So I get that you're trying to do a claim because of reason, but this is where it gets a little wonky. So remember in your textbook that there's a variety of ways to say because. Like you don't just have to always rely on because, and sometimes because won't work. This is an example of where because is not working. So I would go back to the textbook where it talks about the different ways that you can say because and play around with this. So I can see the claim and I can see that you're trying to make the reason, but the wording is a little off. Sorry, the reason why I'm pausing is I'm reading your introductory paragraph because there's a few other things that I wanted to talk to you about, minor editing issues. I think that, yeah, here's it. He goes straight into his work up on the girl. So read this sentence right here. It's the third sentence. And rephrase or do a little bit of editing. I think you just have too many words right here in this phrase right here. So read this out loud and you're going to hear what I'm talking about. I think you just have a typo here. I make sure that you are true to the order of events. He didn't find out that there's a breakout of diphtheria after she refused to open her throat. He mentions it for the first time in the text, but I think he knew that beforehand, right? So again, make sure that you stay true to the order of events. Secondly, make sure that you edit for possessive form. So in this sentence, the more he tries to look at the girl's throat, you included the S to show possession, which means that you need to do an apostrophe S, because if you don't, you're talking about more than one girl. So he's trying to look at multiple girls' throat. That's what you're saying here if you don't include the apostrophe, right? And that's not what you mean. You mean one girl and it's her throat. So you have to use an apostrophe to show possession. So in terms of the key ideas, I think that they are good moments in the text. I think the thing that I want to see you work out is the thesis statement, because I think these ideas would be more meaningful if the thesis statement was fully realized. Because if you were just simply arguing that the use of force is justified, I don't think that all of the key ideas included would necessarily align with that. However, if you're playing around with the gray area, like did he cross the line or not, they could work. So I think that figuring out your answer to this question is a good idea. And let me offer you this. I kind of get the sense that you're probably on the fence. Like, it's a fair question to ask. Like, did he cross the line or not? And if you can't answer that question, like, directly, it's okay to analyze this in terms of why is it important that we ask these questions, right? So maybe that's really what the thesis statement is. What is Williams trying to get us to do with a doctor who's in a life or death situation and resorts to some questionable actions, right? So it's kind of like, does the end justify the means? And probably some audiences would say yes, and some audiences would say no. I think Williams thinks there's some other factors at play, and there's a lot of gray area. So maybe it's thinking about, like I said before, if you can't directly answer it, so the paper is kind of saying, well, it is, but it isn't. And even if we can't come to a definitive answer, what we can do is say, why is it important to have these conversations, especially if you're in a service position, right? And that's what we talked about in class when we discussed this essay. It's why would it be important for doctors to read this essay? You know, does their behavior matter in moments like these? Does their behavior could it potentially shape how a patient will feel? And does patient agency matter, right? Things like that. All right. So that's my feedback that I have for you. And if you have any more questions, just let me know. Thanks.